Hi, welcome back to Peaceful Passages with Theresa Bates and Sarah Onstead. Today, one of the things I want to talk about is some of the biblical references around the concepts that we're talking about. But I also want to talk a little bit about talking about the death positivity and things like that. And I know, Sarah, the death positivity, you introduced me to that particular concept. Even though I understand what it's about, I'd like you to go ahead and explain it for us.
Okay, let's break it down a little bit. I know it sounds kind of weird or strange or macabre or whatever like that.
Right, I mean, it's like death positivity.
Like, what is this thing?
What is that talking?
Like, are you like pro-death? No, we're not pro-death. We're just pro-talking about it because
opening up those conversations.
Exactly, making it a comfortable conversation, because there is a lot of taboo and there's a lot of fear surrounding the subject, and people are like, oh, you shouldn't talk about it, it's too weird. No, like, we're all gonna die, so we might as well talk about it. And so just making that environment so that people can do that. And what's really awesome is that there are these things called death cafes where people can go as a community and talk about all these different issues, and they come from it from all their different perspectives and points of view, whether that's political or community-based or through the medical field or legislation. And with all of these different people in this think tank, they're able to figure out what the problems are, identify what they are, and then also find crazy imaginative solutions that is improving the experience of death and grieving and making it a much easier transition, and also just helping people be educated about their options and what's going on in the world and how they can improve it and make it better for their fellow humanity. Right,
because that's one of the things that I've learned in my limited years of influence, being over 40, is more the fact that a lot of people really try to avoid the topic of death, because thinking about our own mortality,
it's scary.
It is very scary and intimidating. But the last I checked, from history, from the beginning now, there's the 100% mortality rate. So we're not really going to get out of this.
We're not getting away from it. And we are all a little bit curious about it. Like, you pass a car accident or you hear something on the news, and we're always like, oh, what's going on? Like, we have that curiosity there.
And then, and talking about death and dying, it's not just when we're around a funeral, because that's a natural time to talk about it. But being the death positivity, and that's one of the things that I really appreciated going to school with my Jewish brothers and sisters, was they acknowledge death is an absolutely just a normal part of life.
Exactly, just as normal as birth or having a wedding or whatever else.
And scripturally, I know there were, the Father said he's going to restore all things. And in the last 20 to 30 years, he's restored homeschooling.
True.
He's restored home births. He's restored our health and gardening and things like that. And we have the blessed opportunity to be able to talk about the challenging subject of restoring, taking care of our own and our community.
Exactly, and not going through society's perceived way of doing things and questioning it and making it from that perspective of the biblical and the spiritual, bringing it back and looking back at what the different practices were and that sort of thing.
And with the blessing of being at the school and what the Jewish people have done for thousands of years.
They preserved it for us,
They had some of these practices into practice, but people are people. There were some that still carried on the thread of the ritual and how to take care of the dying and when a death occurs. But that ritual that our Jewish brothers and sisters are bringing back in their communities themselves.
It's beautiful, it's
amazing. It's very beautiful. And and instead of avoiding it, and that's one of the things that I really, really liked, is they know that death is a natural part of life, and instead of avoiding it and not talking about it,
they embrace it.
They're embracing it, saying, okay, I know this is going to happen. What can we do to have systems in place to be able to make a very challenging situation easier to help people to walk through it a little bit better.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's one of the things that I really have enjoyed and embraced. And as you're learning, but also you're learning, is it's a topic that I'm very passionate about because it's hard to talk about death. It's hard to talk about dying, and I don't try to talk about it everywhere I go because I know it's a sensitive subject.
Correct. Yeah.
But
you have to be very delicate with it.
Right. But it's also, again, creating that safe space for people to be able to talk about it.
Because people have questions and they don't feel like they are allowed to talk about it or seek those answers because, again, it's weird or taboo or wrong or whatever. It's like, no, it's natural to ask questions and want to know how to deal with this.
Right. And people really don't understand what we do.
Yeah, they have ideas and perceptions. Yeah.
Right. Until when a death occurs, we come in and we do what we do.
And they're amazed.
And then they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. You know, the support, the protocols, and how, you know, how we come around the person that either is on their deathbed dying from an illness,
or there's just surrounding
a car
family.
accident, or a terrorist attack, or anything like that. And we'll cover a lot of those kind of subjects.
More in depth later, yes.
But you know, it's interesting. There are a lot of different scripture references about death and dying in some of the different protocols, but there is such a wide variety of people's opinions, what they like, what they don't like. So I know some of the things that we'll talk about and bring up, not everybody's going to be on the same page.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Because
it's everybody's personal preference and their convictions too.
Right. And sometimes it's their convictions. Sometimes they're stuck in situations that they have to do the best that they can in the time. And I do have some scriptures written down that I want us to, that want us to touch on and go over, but this is not an exhaustive study.
Yeah, this is just a brief overview.
Right, and with covering these particular topics, there is so much. So when we're talking about burial, a lot of people are familiar with the burial of Sarah and the burial of Abraham.
Yeah.
So and Jacob. So you know, in Genesis 23, he was talking about when Abraham buys the cave, Machpelah for Sarah. Well, that's where a lot of the patriarchs,
and matriarchs,
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, where they're buried. Because generally, what I've learned, and this doesn't always happen, but in a lot of the ancient biblical culture is when somebody passes away, they try to keep the families together. So
and we still do that in the modern day. We like to have all our family in one cemetery if possible.
Right. And they have family plots in different cemeteries. And then you have the death of Moses. And that's one of those that is kind of always intriguing because when he passed away, the father had him on the mountain. Well, we don't know where he's buried.
No, which is also a good thing because then people would make it into like a sepulcher or something.
Or sepulcher, or we as people, we like having the physical place to be able to go. Yeah. And for me, that's one of the challenges of cremation is sometimes there's not that place to be able to put the cremains. But from what I see, again, biblically, is whether you're cremated or buried, the precedent that I see biblically is more of burial.
Although there is allowances for cremation.
Absolutely. So in Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, when somebody passes away, they try to have the same day burial. And the reason for that, which is so different than what we do in our society here in the United States, because we generally, when somebody passes away, the society teaches to wait 3, 4, or 5 days to be able to gather the family there, and you know, they do embalming and different things. where with what we teach, we don't embalm, and we try as much as we can to be able to have the same day burial or 24 hours if possible. Because when the life breath was taken out of that particular individual,
you were on a clock. Yeah.
Well, right, but it's also one of those things where to show honor to that physical life that was there, the life is gone.
True.
And we try to bury as fast as possible so that way the decomposition is already starting.
Yeah.
And it happens.
And they didn't have refrigeration back then, too.
Right.
Yeah.
But we still try to honor the deceased and try to get them buried as fast as possible. It actually will help the grieving process. And it's not what we're doing now is wrong, it's just different.
Exactly. Yeah.
And modern burial traditions they're modern burial traditions, that's what we're used to. We're just trying to present another, another option.
Yeah.
And then, so different burial topics. You have about Abraham and Sarah. You have when Joseph was in Egypt. He was embalmed
in the Egyptian practices,
right.
And then his bones were taken away because he wanted to be buried in the Promised Land.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, embalming back in the times of Egypt was a lot different than
they
do
straight up
now.
mummification. Yeah.
But it's they from what I understand, is the process is somewhat the same, but what they used was different.
Yeah.
And the preservation properties were different. Now we use a lot of chemicals and stuff, which is why we generally don't embalm. But also when Joseph was taken from Egypt back to the Promised Land, they carried his bones, not the body.
Yeah.
So the bones were what was carried back. And then they used oils and spices when Messiah was crucified and when he was buried. They followed the same protocols. They had him wrapped in linen and had the spices put around them,
cleansing and honoring,
as was in their custom. And we have a few more scriptures going over Messiah there. But I want to go ahead and cover a little bit about one of the other topics that we talk about a lot is cremation. And we'll go over cremation a little bit more later. But we'll go over, because a couple of the favorite topics that people do talk with me about is, well, Father said cremation's okay.
Or other people don't think it's
right.
okay. Yeah.
And it's a huge controversy.
It is.
And we have the option for people that are out there, and what I'm trying to teach, and whether it teaches here or any other realm that I teach, is learning to respect people with where they're at, what they're doing, because they want to be buried or cremated on how they choose, whether I think it's right or not, whether I support it or not.
You still facilitate and support.
Right, and that's not what I'm trying to support here. I'm just trying to give a lot of information and cover a lot of the different topics.
So then they can make their own decision and see what their personal convictions are. Yeah.
So one of the topics that people say that cremation's acceptable is when they first were starting to use the tabernacle, and Levi's sons were carrying false fire. And I know a lot of you are very familiar with that particular topic. So what happened was they were bringing in false fire, and the scripture says God caused fire to come down and consume them. And there's some people in their thought saying, well, that's why cremation is acceptable.
Yeah. Or some people will say it's not because it was a form of judgment or whatever.
Well, what I see with where I'm at is it's more of a form of judgment because they were doing something that God didn't want done. But my point of bringing that specific one up is more, he took the life breath out of them.
Yeah.
He didn't completely consume them like we do in cremation. And that consumption is just of the life. because if you read a couple verses down just from that, it states that some of the other men, the other priests that were there serving in the temple, they picked them up by their cloaks.
So there was something left.
There was something left, and they didn't fall apart. They weren't a pile of ash, and they still had the clothing. So they picked them up and removed them, and then Levi's other sons took over. So there's that particular topic. And I do want to briefly cover the death of Saul and his sons in 2 Samuel. And where a lot of people see as being cremation being acceptable because of that. So what happened in that particular scenario is when King Saul and his sons had died, it just left me what nationality, what country did this. But they literally hung them on the walls outside of the town.
As a warning and a
as
presentation. And dishonoring.
But it was very dishonoring because they left them as we conquered your king, and this is the way that it's
a lot of disrespect.
Right, it's very much disrespectful. And some of the men, the honorable men, heard about it, and they went to go to bring them back. Why? To give them a proper burial.
Exactly.
But what did they do before they took them back?
They cremated
them. They burned them. Not complete cremation, but they burned them. And so that's why I understand where people are coming from. But when I take myself back in time, why would they do that? Why would they do that? So the particular, what I foresee is putting myself in that time frame, choosing my terminology carefully. When you have a body exposed for that long, and you're going over a long trip, that was a kindness shown to them, because, and I will respectfully say, they probably didn't smell real pretty.
Nope.
And if they're on the back of the wagon and had to go a long distance, that was a kindness shown to them, but they don't have to work with the smell. They don't have to work with the animals, the insects that smell would bring.
Decay,
So they did that out of kindness, then took them back to their territory, and then
gave them the proper
gave them the proper burial. So that's one of the things is if you choose cremation, which would be your option to be able to do, what I see written in Scripture is still bury, because, and we'll cover cremation in another episode, but what you get back are bone fragments.
Yeah, it's not,
and they're not
ashed,
ashes.
No,
because a lot of people think it's ashes. You can put them in water and they'll dissolve.
No.
That doesn't happen because they're little bone
decompose.
fragments. And
Yeah,
so when you spread them, it's going to take a period of time for the bone fragments to work their way back in the soil. So whether you choose burial or cremation or a couple of the other interment options
there's lots
that
of
are out
options.
there, biblically what I see Scripture, and I am open to hear different points of view, is I just, in my spirit, is whatever option you choose is for more burial. One of the other protocols that I learned in school is the act of Shmirah. So again, in 2 Samuel 21, Rizpah, who was one of King Saul's concubines, when her sons died, they had the sons hanging, not from a tree, but hanging up, again, as disrespectful.
Yeah.
But what Rizpah did is she came in, she found them, and she was too weak herself
to actually
get them off of how they were
placed up there.
hanging. Yeah. And so she guarded them. And Shmirah, that's the guarding, the protecting. And when King David found out about it, he sent men there, because what she was doing was honorable, because it wasn't respectful that they were not buried. So he sent men there, took them took them down and gave them a proper burial. So in Jewish tradition now, what they do is, in a funeral home, most of the time, our deceased are at a funeral home, they're in the refrigeration. But with Shmirah, what we do is we have time frames where we go to the funeral home, we have constant prayer from the point of death until the time of burial, and sometimes till the time of cremation. Right, and we're there guarding, we're protecting. We know nothing bad is going to happen to the person, but we're ushering them so they're not walking this.
And it's a form of honoring.
Right, right, and the tradition, and their transition from the physical to the spiritual. But I also want to cover a little bit of Shiva, and we were talking in the first episode on trying to ignore when death happens.
Yeah, the society's expectation is, someone dies, bury them as quickly as possible, and go back to work immediately. Like, there's no time to breathe or recognize the life that's been lost, or just recognize your own emotions and what's going on. And you just need that space to process. Right,
because using you as an example, say that a loved one of yours passes away. Generally, what we try to do is we acknowledge the death, but it's like, Sarah, I'm so sorry, but let's get you back at work. Let's get you back doing things again, so that way you can get past this.
Yeah.
And I think this is another one of the gems that the Jewish people really hold on to, and they've preserved. Joe practiced Shiva. Shiva means 7. They mourned the loss 7 days and 7 nights. When Saul passed away, when his sons were hung on the wall, they fasted 7 days. And when Jacob had passed away, they mourned for so many days. And it's taking that time frame and letting the mourner, which the mourner is usually the spouse,
close family,
the very close family, spouse, parent, children,
siblings, whoever.
The one that is very much the one that had the closest relationship with them would be the mourners, and of having the 7 days to mourn the loss of their loved one. And then after that, one of the beautiful things is, in the Jewish tradition, they have stepstones.
They continue the support system.
Right. So instead of trying to get everything done quickly and then go live your life, what they do is they want you to, you're not a prisoner in your home, but stay home for the 7 days.
Yeah.
And then they go outside. You have a friend that go outside, either around the house if it's big, around your community block, but you're walking out of the house of mourning and you're walking around going back into the community again. So that way it's the transition. And 30 days after that, you revisit and make an appointment to mourn that loss again. So that way it's not, we're going to forget about them. It's like, no, 30 days.
We're going to work through this and process it. Yeah.
And generally what we do now is we have we bury as fast as possible, and then let the emotion go on, but then have a memorial or a celebration of life about 30 days later. And it gives the sting of death to be able to
ease a little.
Bit,
so
like you were saying.
So it's not so intense.
Right. Yeah. And then 1 year after that, which would at that point would be 11 months, that's when they would do the revealing of the headstone. So that way you have blocks of time and it's not an endless having to walk this out.
Yeah.
And what I've seen is when you embrace it and you have those stepstones to be able to walk through, it helps people to be able to know that there's an end in sight. Yes, it's my anniversary. And having people, one of the things I've learned is to when somebody passes away, I put that on my phone to have that as a yearly reminder. And you'd be amazed at how many people say, oh my gosh, you remembered.
Exactly.
And
because people forget or they don't want to think about it.
Right.
And the person's still grieving and they need that support.
Right. And instead of running away when a death happens. It's what can we do as a community to help support you, not just short term,
No,
but
long-term
long
vision.
term as well.
Yeah.
And those are some of the scriptural references that I had written down, and I know there's so much
There's so
more.
much more. Yeah.
Because what we have written in the New Testament, there's a lot of scripture reference showing that Messiah and his family not just walked out the protocol of the day, but he was fulfilling the history as well. And we're still embracing where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, we're still walking those ancient paths that we've done before.
Exactly.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about death denial? We have just a few minutes left in our program.
It's a big topic and we can talk about it more, but just, again, having those conversations with your family and with your friends, and like how we previously stated about advanced directives and that kind of thing, but like, it's not only just that, it's recognizing your own mortality and learning to be okay with that and embracing it, and then what does that mean for long term, and then how does that challenge your faith, whether it's like thoughts about the afterlife and that kind of thing, and what is your faith, what is your relationship with God, what is your relationship with other people that you're around, how are you affecting people, like if you died tomorrow, like would people like know that you were a good person, like it's helps you also realize what are you putting out into the world and living your life to the fullest and showing God's love and that sort of thing.
Right.
But then also having those tough conversations with your family members who are like, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to deal with this.
Right. I know it's a hard subject to sometimes to be able to talk about.
Yeah.
But it definitely is an important one. If you're biblically minded, you want to try to do things a little bit more in the biblical. And I'm not against using funeral homes or things like that. They absolutely have a very specific purpose. But this is just another option that a lot of people don't know. That there's people that are trained like myself, and you're becoming trained on how we take care of loved ones when a death occurs. How much responsibility, how much do you want the community to step in and to follow some of the rituals, or to have systems in place so the community can come around? Because one of the things that I've seen happen is when a death occurs, what do we say? How do we say it? And a lot of people, when they haven't faced the reality of, there's one point where I know I'm going to die. I know I'm going to pass away. What do I want? How do we want everything to happen?
Yeah.
So, and opening up those conversations. So,
Precisely.
and that's what we're trying to learn. So, I want to thank you all. It was a very fast show, but I want to thank you all for joining us with Peaceful Passages, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.